People will forgive you for being cruel once. What they don't forgive, what they can't quite ever put back together, is finding out you were cruel on purpose, with paperwork, using the exact skills you spent years training yourself to use for other people's protection. 10 days after my mother's funeral, I sat at my father's kitchen table in the house on Larkspur Lane, slid a quitclaim deed in front of him, and watched him sign away 31 years of his life because I told him it was the smart thing to do. I was a licensed real estate attorney in the state of Ohio. I knew exactly what I was asking him to sign. I knew the alternative structures that would have protected him fully, and I chose not to offer them. I did it anyway. That's the part I don't get to soften. No matter how the rest of this goes, no matter how it ends. My name is Veronica Ashford. Everyone calls me Ronnie. I'm 34 years old, I live in Cincinnati, and I've spent the last 9 years practicing real estate law, the last 4 of them running my own small firm out of a converted row house in Hyde Park, 3 associates, 1 paralegal. A good reputation in a niche corner of the local bar. I tell you all of that up front because it matters. Because what happened to my father wasn't an accident of grief or a lapse in judgment made by someone who didn't know better. It was a competent professional using a competent professional's tools on the one person in the world who trusted her completely, without conditions. The way he trusted almost nothing else in his life. Let me back up though, because you need to understand how it started, and it didn't start with a deed. It started years before that, in a house that smelled like sawdust and rose oil, with a woman named June Ashford who I did not appreciate while she was alive, and a man named Walter Ashford who I have spent the better part of a decade underestimating. My mother, June, taught 3rd grade for 26 years at Fairview Elementary. The kind of teacher former students still send Christmas cards to decades later, the kind who remembered every kid's reading level and every kid's home situation, and treated both like private information worth protecting. My father, Walter, taught shop class at the high school one town over until he retired at 62. And even after retirement, he never stopped being a man who fixed things with his hands, squeaky hinges, other people's lawnmowers, a neighbor's fence that had been leaning for a decade until my father quietly showed up one Saturday with a level and a bag of concrete and fixed it without being asked. Every morning of my childhood, without fail, he was up at 6, in the side yard. In his undershirt no matter the weather, tending the rose bed my mother had planted the year they bought the house, 4 Larkspur Lane, a modest 3-bedroom colonial they closed on in the spring of 1988 for $61,000. A fact my father recited so often it became a kind of family liturgy, the same way some families recite grace. He'd deadhead the blooms, check the soil pH with a little meter he kept in a coffee can, talk to the roses the way some men talk to their cars. My mother used to say he loved those roses because they were the one thing in his life that bloomed on a schedule he could actually control, and I think now she was being kinder about that habit than most wives would have been. The other ritual, the one that mattered more to me as a kid than I ever let on, was the porch light. My father left it burning every single night, rain or shine, whether anyone was expected home or not. When I was 17 and staying out past curfew with a boy named Trent Alvarez who drove a rusted-out Camaro with a hole in the passenger floorboard you could watch the road through. I'd come home at 1, 2 in the morning, and that light would be on, glowing yellow over the porch steps, and my father would be in his recliner, pretending to watch the 11 o'clock news rerun. Not really asleep, not really awake, just waiting. He never yelled about the curfew, not once, not even the night I came home smelling like a party he definitely knew about. He said the light wasn't a punishment, it was a promise that no matter what time I got in, or what kind of trouble I dragged in behind me, there'd be a door that opened for me without conditions attached. I used to think that was corny, the kind of thing you'd find cross-stitched on a pillow. I understand now it was the entire architecture of who he was, distilled into a 40-watt bulb he replaced without complaint every time it burned out. We weren't a rich family, and money moved through our house the way it moves through most working families, carefully, with visible strain some months, and unevenly between the two kids. My older brother Dean was, by unspoken family consensus, the reliable one. He went into insurance underwriting straight out of state college, married young to a woman named Katie from his hometown, bought a house 11 minutes from my parents, had 2 kids by 28, and became the son my parents could point to at church functions, without qualification. I was the one who left. I went to law school on loans, moved to the city, called on Sundays if I remembered, and came home for maybe 4 holidays a year, usually late and usually distracted, checking my phone under the table during dinner. Dean liked that arrangement more than he ever admitted out loud. My distance made his closeness look better by comparison, and over the years I watched him quietly encourage it. A joke here about how some of us actually still visit, a comment there about how mom and dad probably forgot what you look like, delivered at Thanksgiving with just enough of a laugh attached that calling it out would have made me the humorless one. He wasn't a villain. He was a man protecting a role he'd built his entire identity around. And my absence was useful to him in ways neither of us said out loud. I want to be honest about that instead of making him the reason for anything I did later, because he didn't hand me the pen at that kitchen table. I picked it up myself. I remember one Thanksgiving specifically, the year I was 26, home for 31 hours between 2 flights, when Dean cornered me by the coat closet before dinner and said, not unkindly, but not gently either, "You know Dad brags about you to everyone at the hardware store, right? The lawyer daughter." Meanwhile, I'm the one who actually shows up. I told him showing up wasn't a competition. He said, "Everything's a competition, Ron. You just won yours somewhere else." I laughed it off at the table 20 minutes later when he made a version of the same joke for an audience, and my father laughed along too, and I told myself it didn't sting. And it did. And I filed that sting away somewhere I didn't look at again for a long time, the way you file away a lot of things that turn out to matter more than you gave them credit for at the time. There's one more detail from those years that matters, small as it is, so I'll say it plainly. My mother kept one mug, chipped on the handle, glazed a deep cornflower blue, that she'd made herself in a community pottery class the year before Dean was born. It wasn't a good mug. By any objective measure, the glaze had pooled unevenly at the base. The handle was too small for an adult hand. But she used it every day for 30 years anyway. After she got sick, my father claimed it, said the coffee tasted better out of it, and started using it every single morning at 6, right alongside the rosebed ritual. Rosebed. Porch light. The blue mug. I'm telling you about these 3 things now because I didn't think about any of them again for 6 years after my mother died. And then, all at once, I couldn't stop thinking about them. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in March, the aggressive kind, the kind where the oncologist uses the phrase comfort focused in the same sentence as the diagnosis itself, which is doctor, for there is no long fight coming, only a short one. She died 11 weeks later, on a Tuesday, in the house on Larkspur Lane, in the bed she'd shared with my father for 3 decades, with my father holding her hand and me on a flight that landed 40 minutes after she was gone. I flew in for the funeral. I flew in, I have to be honest and say, already thinking about the house. I want to be precise about my state of mind at that time, because vagueness here would be its own kind of dishonesty. A softer lie standing in for the harder truth. My firm was 2 years old and hemorrhaging money. I'd taken out a business line of credit at 9% interest to cover payroll for myself and one paralegal, and I was roughly 3 months from either finding $40,000 in working capital or laying myself off from the company I'd built. I knew, because I'd pulled the county assessor records the week my mother died. I want you to sit with that timeline, because I have had to sit with it myself, that Larkspur Lane was worth somewhere around $310,000, fully paid off, no lien, no mortgage, clean title. I knew my father's only income going forward was a modest teacher's pension and Social Security. Nowhere close to the property's value. I knew that grief makes people compliant in a very specific, very exploitable way. I had watched it happen to clients' elderly parents dozens of times, in exactly the contexts I now specialized in professionally, and I understood the mechanism the way a locksmith understands the inside of a lock. I am not proud of how quickly that understanding turned from professional knowledge into a plan. 10 days after the funeral, while sympathy casseroles were still stacked in the freezer, while my father was still wearing his wedding ring on the wrong finger because his hands had swelled slightly and he hadn't thought to say anything about it, I told him I wanted to help him get ahead of the paperwork before Medicaid spend down rules or estate complications made things harder later. A real risk, technically, dressed up to look like the only risk in the room. I told him a quitclaim deed transferring the house into my name, paired with a promise of a life estate letting him stay as long as he wanted, was the cleanest way to protect the asset from future problems. Every word of that sentence was technically true, and every word of it was a lie by omission. Because a life estate clause could have been drafted and filed just as easily without transferring ownership at all, that structure exists, specifically for cases like his, and I never once mentioned it as an option. I chose, deliberately, out of every tool available to me, the version that put the deed in my name. He signed it at that kitchen table, in his reading glasses, 3 days before what would have been his and my mother's 33rd wedding anniversary, using the same pen he'd used to sign his retirement paperwork years earlier, a cheap ballpoint from a bank that no longer existed under that name. He read it slowly, the way he read everything, moving his finger along the lines. He asked me only one question the whole time. He said, "This doesn't change anything, right? I still get to keep her roses going out there?" I told him nothing would change. I told him it was just paperwork. I notarized part of the transaction myself through my own firm, which I now knew then, actually, with total and uncomfortable clarity, sat somewhere in the gray zone of my state bar's conflict of interest rules for attorneys transacting real property with immediate family members. I filed the deed with the county recorder's office on a Thursday morning, sandwiched between 2 unrelated closings on my calendar, the way you'd squeeze in a dentist appointment. It took the clerk 11 minutes to process. There was an off-ramp, a real one, and I want to describe it honestly instead of skipping past it the way I skipped past it in real life. My paralegal at the time, a sharp, careful woman named Priya Deshmukh, saw the file open on my desk 2 days before I recorded it. She asked, not accusingly, just carefully, the way she asked about everything. Whether I'd considered a revocable trust structure instead, something that would let me help manage the asset without actually taking title, something that would protect my father's autonomy along with the property itself. "It's cleaner for the family, usually," she said. "Especially this soon after a death. Judges look at timing." I told her I'd considered it and decided against it for tax reasons. That was false. I decided against it because a trust doesn't let you refinance an asset for working capital the way a deed in your own name does, and I needed working capital more than I needed to admit that to myself. Priya didn't push further. I think she trusted that I knew what I was doing, professionally and morally, in the way junior staff trust the person whose name is on the door. And I let her keep trusting that, because it was convenient, and because confronting her doubt would have meant confronting my own. There was a second off-ramp too, quieter than the first, and I nearly took it. Dean called me the week after the filing went through, not because he knew at that point what exactly had happened, but because my father had mentioned to him offhand over a Sunday phone call that Ronnie helped me sort out some paperwork on the house. Dean, suspicious in the low-grade way he was suspicious of most of my professional life, asked me directly what that meant. I told him, carefully, that I'd helped set up a protective structure in case of future medical costs, which was true in the sense that individual words in the sentence were true, and false in the sense that the sentence as a whole was engineered to mislead. Dean said, "As long as Dad still owns the place, I don't care what kind of lawyer stuff you did." I said nothing to correct him. I let my own brother believe our father still held title to his own house, because correcting him would have meant saying the sentence out loud to another human being for the first time, and I wasn't ready to hear how it sounded. 6 weeks later, I refinanced the house, my house now, on paper, for $180,000. Using it as collateral for a business loan that kept my firm solvent through the worst stretch of its second year. I remember sitting in the loan officer's office at Fifth Third, signing initials on page after page, and feeling something close to relief. The specific relief of a person who has just successfully avoided a catastrophe by creating a smaller, quieter one somewhere else. My father, still living there under our informal, entirely undocumented life estate understanding, never saw a single document from that transaction. He kept tending the roses. He kept the porch light on every night. He had no idea he was living, rent-free by his own generous account, in a house he no longer legally owned, funding my company's survival with equity he didn't know he'd surrendered. What followed was not one dramatic rupture. It was 6 years of a slow, deliberate drift, and I want to describe it in the plain terms it deserves, because the flat version is worse, somehow, than any dramatic version could be. For the first 18 months, I told myself the arrangement was temporary, that once the firm stabilized, I'd quietly redeed the house back to him. And no one would ever need to know there'd been a gap at all, that the whole thing would simply disappear into a footnote only I remembered. The firm stabilized within that window. I didn't redeed anything. 2 years in, I moved my father, gently, and with what I told myself at the time was genuine compassion, into a small 2-bedroom rental apartment 8 minutes from Larkspur Lane, explaining that the house was getting to be too much for him to maintain alone at his age, a line I'd rehearsed in the car on the drive over. I paid the first year's rent myself, which felt, in the moment, like generosity, and which I now understand was closer to hush money I hadn't even needed to negotiate, because he never once asked what I intended to do with the house itself. I sold Larkspur Lane in year 3 to a young couple named the Hendersons for $334,000, $24,000 over what it had been worth when I first pulled those assessor records. I used the proceeds to buy out my business partner and take full, sole ownership of the firm, a milestone I celebrated that same week with a bottle of champagne and my associates, none of whom knew where the capital had come from. I did not tell my father the house had sold. When he asked, over an increasingly rare phone call, whether the roses were doing all right out there, I told him I'd arranged for the new tenants to keep them up, a total fabrication delivered without hesitation. There were no tenants. There was a family who had the rose bed torn out within a month of closing to put in a paver patio and a fire pit, a fact I knew firsthand because I had personally handled their closing and later seen the landscaping permit application cross my desk on an unrelated matter. Professional success, in those years, felt to me like proof I'd made the right call. Evidence I could point to whenever a stray thought about the deed surfaced. I moved my office to a bigger space on Erie Avenue, with my name etched into the glass door. I hired 2 more associates. I told colleagues, in the loose, self-flattering way people describe their families at networking dinners over the second glass of wine, that I'd helped my dad simplify his finances after my mother passed, and people nodded approvingly. Because it sounded responsible, because it was the kind of sentence engineered to hide everything by sounding like nothing at all. I missed calls. I want to name that specifically because it's the detail that shames me more in hindsight than the deed itself. My father called on a Sunday afternoon in the 4th year, and I let it go to voicemail because I was drafting a closing document due first thing Monday morning and told myself I'd call back that night. I didn't. I never called back that week at all. I found out 3 weeks later, from Dean, in a text message with almost no punctuation, that our father had been hospitalized for 4 days with an irregular heartbeat, a cardiac event serious enough that they'd kept him under observation on a telemetry floor, and that from the hospital bed he had asked more than once, according to a nurse Dean spoke with, whether Ronnie knew yet. Dean's text ended with just 4 words. He kept asking, "Ron, I didn't fly in." I sent an arrangement of flowers to the rehab facility he was discharged to and told myself, for longer than I'd like to admit, that the flowers counted for something close to presence. There were moments I almost reached back across the distance I'd built, brick by brick, without ever quite deciding to build it. Once, in the 5th year, driving home from a closing on the west side, I passed a hardware store with a rose fertilizer display in the front window, the same brand, the same bright green bag my father used to buy by the case, and I sat in my car in that parking lot for 11 minutes without moving, keys in my lap, before I finally drove home and didn't call him. That's as close as I came, for years, to reckoning with any of it. I remember thinking, sitting there, that 11 minutes felt like a significant amount of time to spend almost doing the right thing and then not doing it. By the 5th year, my father had started, without ever framing it as such, quietly withdrawing from the version of the relationship that required him to reach for me. He stopped asking when I'd next visit. He stopped mentioning things he'd read about in the news that he thought I'd find interesting, a habit he'd kept up since I was in college. When Dean's youngest graduated high school that spring, my father gave a short toast at the party that mentioned Dean's family by name, one by one, and said only, generally, that he was proud of both his kids. Without naming me specifically, a small omission I noticed and chose, in the moment, to interpret as an accident of a man getting older rather than what it likely was, a father learning, carefully and without announcing it, to expect less from the daughter who kept giving him less. The discovery, the thing that actually broke this open. That I could not manage my way around the way I'd managed everything else. Didn't come from my father at all, and it didn't come the way I would have imagined it if I'd ever let myself imagine it. It came from a phone call I almost let go to voicemail on an ordinary Tuesday in the 6th year from a real estate attorney named David Feld. A name I recognized vaguely from title work on the east side of the city. He was calling about what I assumed, from the caller ID and the case number in the subject line of his earlier email, was an unrelated matter, a title insurance claim on a property my firm had closed 2 years prior, where an old mechanic's lien had surfaced that should have been cleared before closing and hadn't been. Exposing my firm to a potential malpractice claim that could have cost me somewhere around $90,000 and, depending on how the bar handled it, my license along with it. I braced, physically, in my chair, for the worst call of my professional life. Instead, David Feld said something that stopped me cold in a completely different way. He said the lien had already been resolved, paid off in full, 8 months earlier, by a private third party, and he was only calling now to confirm the paperwork matched county records before he formally closed his file. I asked carefully, keeping my voice level, who the private party was. There was a pause on the line, the specific kind of pause a person takes when they're deciding whether it's their place to say something they know will land badly. Then, he told me, Walter Ashford. I didn't understand at first. I asked if he meant my father had simply co-signed as a formality, maybe at my request through some intermediary I'd forgotten about. He said no. Walter Ashford had personally walked into his office 8 months earlier and paid $11,400 in a cashier's check to satisfy the lien in full, entirely on his own, before I had any idea a malpractice exposure even existed. I asked how my father could possibly have known about a claim I hadn't known about myself. Feld told me, in the careful, faintly apologetic voice attorneys use around other attorneys' family business, that my father had apparently been checking the county recorder's website for years. The same public records portal I'd used to price his own house before my mother's funeral, watching for anything filed under my name or my firm's name. Because, in Feld's words, quoting something my father had told him almost verbatim while signing the paperwork, he said if something ever came back on you, from the house or from anything else, he wanted to be the one standing in front of it before it ever reached you. I asked him to send me whatever paperwork he had, and I heard my own voice come out flatter than I expected, almost clinical. The way I sound when I'm trying very hard not to feel something in real time. What arrived by email that evening was a scanned folder, 22 pages, containing canceled checks going back nearly 4 years, a handwritten ledger in my father's cramped, careful shop teacher print, the same print he used to label tool drawers, tracking 3 separate instances where he had quietly paid down debts or resolved liens connected to properties I had personally handled, totaling just over $26,000, drawn from a pension and Social Security income that should not, by any reasonable math, have stretched that far without him going without something else. Attached to the last entry in the folder was a note, not addressed to me. Apparently, just a note he'd written to himself and never sent. That read, "If the deed ever comes up, tell them it was my idea." She was trying to help me. He had spent years preparing, quietly and without complaint, to take the blame for what I had done to him. I want to describe the ledger itself in more detail, because the specificity of it is what finally made the whole thing real to me, in a way the phone call alone hadn't. The first entry was dated 14 months after I'd sold Larkspur Lane for $4,200, marked in his handwriting simply as roof claim, Fenwick St. Property, ours firm. I hadn't handled a Fenwick Street closing in years. I had to go back through my own files to confirm it was mine. A small title defect I'd missed on an inspection that had apparently resurfaced as a claim against my errors and omissions coverage, a claim that never reached me, because my father had paid the shortfall on my deductible directly to the claimant before it escalated to my insurer. The second entry, $11,400, was the lien Feld had called about. The third, the smallest, $680, was marked only filing fee, Ronnie's late renewal, which I eventually understood referred to a state bar licensing fee I'd nearly let lapse one chaotic spring without noticing. A lapse that would have meant practicing law without an active license for 11 days, had someone not paid it. I never found out how he'd even known about that one. I still don't know. I sat in my car outside my own office for over an hour that evening with that folder open on my phone, scrolling back through it twice. I want to describe what that felt like as honestly as I can, without dressing it up into something more cinematic than it was. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't only guilt either. It was a specific kind of disorientation, a physical sensation like the floor tilting slightly under a chair that hadn't moved, because I had spent 6 years telling myself a coherent story in which I was the competent one, managing an aging parent's affairs with a professional's clear head, and the actual document trail in front of me showed a man who had understood exactly what I'd done to him from very early on, and who had chosen, every single time the opportunity presented itself, to protect me from the consequences instead of exposing me to them. I drove to his apartment that night without calling ahead, which I hadn't done in years. He was in the recliner he'd kept from the old house, the one piece of furniture that had made the move with him. The blue mug on the side table, even though it was past 9 at night and long cold. When I told him what David Feld had said, laying the whole thing out flat on his kitchen table the way I'd laid the deed out on his old one 6 years earlier, he didn't deny any of it, and he didn't perform forgiveness either. He just looked tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He said, "I figured you'd find out eventually. I just didn't think it'd be a lawyer who told you instead of me." I asked him why he'd never confronted me directly, why he'd let me believe for 6 years that he simply hadn't noticed any of it. He said, "I noticed the day you filed it. County website sends you an alert if you set it up right. Dean showed me how to do that, actually, years back, for something else entirely. My own brother, the reliable one, had unknowingly handed my father the exact tool that let him watch me, silently, in real time, for 6 years, while I assumed his ignorance was the only thing protecting me. What followed over the next several months was not a single confrontation, but a slow unspooling of every motif I'd carried out of that house, without ever recognizing their weight while I still had them. I drove past Larkspur Lane on a Sunday and saw the paver patio and fire pit where the rose bed used to be, and for the first time in 6 years I let myself actually grieve the roses. Not as an abstraction, but as a specific, particular loss my father had never once complained about to me. Though he had clearly noticed it, Feld's folder, it turned out, included a printout dated the week after the sale closed. Of a Google Street View image of the house, the rose bed already gone, the paver stones freshly laid, with nothing written on it, just the image itself, saved and kept. I asked him, on one of the visits that followed, why he kept using the blue mug when the chip in the handle was bad enough now to be a real hazard, sharp along one edge, and he told me, plainly, without ceremony, that it was the last thing of my mother's he touched every single day. First thing, before anything else in his morning. And that some habits aren't really about convenience. They're about refusing to let go of the 1 hour of the day that still feels like she's in the room. I understood, hearing that, sitting across from him at a kitchen table that wasn't the one I'd betrayed him at, but felt like it anyway, that everything I'd taken from him, the house, the roses, 6 years of ordinary Sunday phone calls, the small, unremarkable texture of being someone's daughter, I had taken from a man who was already holding on to the last pieces of his life with both hands, and I had decided my business's cash flow was worth more than his grip. I told Dean too, eventually, in a phone call I dreaded more than the one with my father, because I expected him to say something along the lines of, "I always knew you were like this," and some small, defensive part of me had a rebuttal ready even before he spoke. He didn't say that. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I let him die on Sundays for 4 years, Ron, same as you did. I just did it 11 minutes away instead of 200 miles away. Don't make this only about you." It wasn't the absolution I might have wanted, and it wasn't the accusation I'd braced for either. It was the truest thing anyone in my family said to me that whole year, and it cost me something to hear it, and it cost him something to say it, and neither of us apologized to the other, because neither of us was owed one yet. The direct confrontation I owed him, the real one, came on a different Sunday, at his kitchen table in the small apartment. No witnesses, no audience, just the two of us and 2 cups of coffee going cold. I told him, without qualifiers, without the softening language I'd used on myself for 6 years, that I had exploited his grief to take his house. That I had lied to Priya about my reasons for structuring the deed the way I did. That I had sold the house without telling him and let him believe strangers were tending roses that no longer existed. And that I had let him quietly carry $26,000 of debt that was mine to carry, in silence, for years, because it was easier than facing what I'd done to him. He listened to all of it without interrupting once, his hands flat on the table. When I finished, he said only, "I know. I've known the whole time. I just needed you to know that I knew." It was the shortest sentence anyone has ever used to take me completely apart. I will not tell you this ended in a clean reunion, because it didn't, and pretending otherwise would dishonor what it actually cost both of us to get to where we are now. I offered to buy him a house outright, immediately, with money from the firm, a large, dramatic gesture of instant repair. He said no. He said a house wouldn't undo 6 years, and that he didn't want a gesture that size from me. Because it would let me feel finished with something that isn't finished, might not be finished for a long time yet, if ever completely. What he asked for instead was smaller and, in its way, much harder Sunday dinners, every week, no exceptions, starting immediately, for as long as it took him to trust that I would actually show up without being reminded. I have missed exactly 1 Sunday in the 14 months since, for a family funeral on my former partner's side, and I called him myself from the parking lot beforehand to tell him in person, on the phone. Because I understood, finally, what a missed call from me had once cost him, waiting alone in a hospital bed asking a nurse if his daughter knew yet. I paid back, in full, the $26,000 he'd spent covering my liabilities, wired directly to his account with no note attached, because he told me, when I asked what to write, that a note would make the gesture about my conscience instead of his money, and he was right. I found a rose cutting from the original bed after 6 phone calls and a fair amount of humility on my part. The Hendersons, it turned out, had given a few uprooted canes to a neighbor before tearing the rest out for the patio, and that neighbor, an older woman named Barb, who remembered my mother from the neighborhood association, still had one alive in a pot on her back deck, and gave it to me without hesitation, once she understood who I was and why I was asking. I brought it to my father's apartment building, and we planted it together in a half-barrel by his back door, using the same brand of fertilizer from the hardware store I'd once sat outside of for 11 minutes without going in. It isn't 31 years of rosebed, it's 1 cutting in a barrel, 4 canes, not yet a single bloom as of this telling. He waters it every morning at 6 anyway, in his undershirt, the same as always. The first Sunday dinner, in particular, I remember more clearly than almost anything else from that year. I brought a store-bought lasagna because I didn't trust myself to cook something that mattered as much as that dinner mattered, and we ate mostly in silence at his small kitchen table. The recliner visible from where I sat, the blue mug sitting empty in the dish rack because it was evening by then. Halfway through, he asked me, out of nowhere, whether my firm was doing all right, genuinely curious, no edge in it, and I understood that he was trying, in his own careful way, to find a normal question to ask, the kind fathers ask daughters. And I answered him honestly, in detail, the way I hadn't in years, and it was the most ordinary 10 minutes of conversation we'd had since before my mother died, and it undid me more than the confrontation had. The porch light, it turns out, was the piece I got to keep in the smallest and truest way available to me. His apartment building doesn't allow modifications to the exterior fixtures, so instead I started leaving my own porch light on every night at my place across town. Not for him, he'll likely never see it, never drive past it, but because I finally understood what he meant, all those years ago, about a light being a promise instead of a punishment. Something you keep burning whether or not anyone's watching. I don't get to give him back the original light over the original door. I can only be, going forward, the kind of daughter who leaves one on somewhere. He still uses the blue mug every morning, chip and all. I bought him a second one, nearly identical from a small pottery studio 2 towns over, in case the original ever finally breaks past the point of use. He keeps it in the cabinet, unused, still in its box. He told me he's not ready to let the real one go, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I told him he doesn't have to be, and meant it without an agenda underneath the words. What I understand now, that I did not understand 10 days past my mother's funeral. Sitting across a kitchen table with a pen in my hand and a business loan on my mind, is that trust isn't a resource you can quietly withdraw from someone without them noticing, even if it takes them years to say so out loud. My father knew what I had done almost from the beginning, and instead of using that knowledge to punish me the way I would have deserved, he spent it protecting me instead. Which is a form of love I don't think I earned, and don't think I can ever fully repay, only keep earning, one ordinary Sunday at a time, for as long as he'll let me. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.